The following webinar is presented by the E-Extension Farm Energy Community of Practice at extension.org and the University of Nebraska Lincoln Extension.
Welcome, everyone. My name is John Hay. Welcome to today's Bioenergy Friday web seminar. Thank you for joining us today. We've got a good speaker. Today's presentation is on farm energy efficiency, which I think is one that is some of that low-hanging fruit. And I'm excited to introduce Chad Martin from Purdue University. Chad is a Renewable Energy Extension Specialist in the Ag and Biological Engineering Department at Purdue and has done quite a lot with energy efficiency on the farm through his years there at Purdue. Welcome, Chad.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you to Iowa State and E-Extension for the invitation to present today. And we appreciate the opportunity today to talk about our program at Purdue in regard to energy efficiency improvements. And this is an effort that we have worked with several partners across the state of Indiana to get established. Our USDA rural development here in Indiana has been a key collaborator and in fact provides some funding for us to do this work as well as to our clients. And especially Dr. Klein Aliligy, he is our lead extension engineer here at ABE on this area and leads the Renewable Energy Extension Outreach Program currently in China. But then we also have other people that have just really made this effort possible. And so I'll discuss a bit about that as we move forward. But here, when I first came to work in this role, just about 5 years ago, there was quite a bit of inertia and momentum coming through the biofuel sector. And so we soon found out that there was a lot of activity with just a lot of areas of energy, not only for biofuels, but Indiana became the fastest growing wind power state in the country in 2008 and early 2009, while we also have a substantial hardwood industry for biomass opportunities, as well as being a pretty substantial coal state. So we don't really necessarily have a key area when it comes to energy that we focus on, but we try to look at the broader picture in not only this perspective of renewable energy, but responsible energy use. And so with developing our program, we wanted to make sure that folks were equipped to be able to make proper decisions when it comes to making energy and efficiency improvements on the farm. And we also had some folks interested in putting in small distributed wind or solar systems, and we wanted those projects to also be successful. So with all that complex maze of information that a producer has to go through, or anyone for that matter, when they're looking at energy issues, we have to ask a lot of hard questions. And while it may be glamorous to maybe put up a small wind turbine or something of that nature, we really need to take a few steps back and look at energy usage before we go to that level of investment of a new capital or energy production system. So, we take a producer through several steps of asking questions, what is the energy, where is it being used and what quality level? I had a producer first ask, what's the potential for me putting up a turbine to run my grain drying system out? Because I don't want to put in a large investment of running the utility lines out to this new facility. And, when it all came down to it, it just wasn't going to be a feasible option, let's just be honest. But there was a lot of things that we had to walk through in terms of evaluating that wind system. But first, we wanted to make sure we were looking at energy efficiency before we went down that path. But oftentimes producers will come to us and ask, and many of us in extension, I want to make an upgrade. Is this going to be a logical step for me to take? And that's a very fair question to ask. And then after that, perhaps there is some opportunity out there for renewable energy. And I'll talk a bit about solar hot water potential, for groups like dairy farms and so on. But the most, primary part that a lot of producers are interested in, can it pay itself back? And, renewable systems, they are They are beneficial. They can, certainly offset some of your utility bill use, but at the same time, they have to earn their keep. And the important part is being able to put up a wind turbine where wind is available, and also not putting in solar systems where there's shade. So at any rate, there are primary areas that we are looking into here at Purdue. Before I even had a telephone here at Purdue, I had various phone calls with the grain drying energy audits, and Dr. Dirk Meyer, who was at that time here at Purdue when I first was here, worked with us and looked at, how can we utilize the tools that he has created and developed and validated over the time of his work here research-wise at Purdue on grain drying. How can we apply those to make them beneficial and useful? And so we really got our feet on the ground with the grain drying side of things. And then also, too, with some collaborations with Michigan State University, and I'm going to talk about some of the examples that we've gone through up at Michigan State and collaboration there, Algo and Truman Sherbrooke. Very excellent, program that they operate up there with some of their teams. And so we were able to benefit from some of their extension programming. So I'll talk a bit more about that as well. When we look at the total perspective of energy use on the farm, obviously diesel and gasoline are big fuel bills for producers. And then, of course, we have electricity with a lot more automation on farm that we've had and continues to exponentially grow in terms of the amount of automation that we're seeing. And so utility companies, particularly in the rural areas, are scrambling to help producers to be able to get quality, viable electrical power and service to their operations. And then, of course, we have natural gas and propane that would fall into that other category. We're going to kind of focus today on this left-hand part of this graph. There's certainly opportunities for improving efficiency within your diesel engines and so on, but we're going to focus on some of the electrical side and also fuel, particularly when it comes to grain drying, because that's one of the, we're going to start with grain drying. Of course, that's the most, the largest fuel guzzler and electrical power guzzler, it seems, especially during this time of year for producers. But one of the first questions that we often have is, do you have ample electrical service? Because, a lot of times farmers and particularly in Indiana, we don't have the luxury of having three-phase power prolifically distributed throughout our state as, say, what I understand Nebraska has. So with that being said, we have some demand rate charges that are oftentimes come into play, and so that becomes a real eye-opener for producers when they get that bill right after the drying season and they're asking questions, or even like an irrigation system. Where's this demand charge coming from? And I'd like to cite an example. Just to cite this, Iowa State, there was a publication that came out, and I really liked the example. There was a producer that, an example, had 3 10-horsepower motors that they just wanted to fire up and see how they were operating in August before grain drying season, and their aeration fans. So they fired them up all 3 at once and just operated those for just 20 minutes. So during that period of time, there was, a pretty substantial level of kilowatts actually consumed at that one point in time, and they shut them down after 20 minutes. Well, of course, in an example here, the meter was read 2 days after that point in time, and so that set the demand rate for that entire month of August. And so all of a sudden, when it all calculated out, they were charged about $300 just for firing up those fans and then shutting them off after 20 minutes. It's not the same situation as kilowatt hours, so they only operate them shortly. So there's some of that to consider, and maybe some variable frequency drives and some of these other things that might make things more logical for producers, because three-phase power is not a cheap thing to bring in. I've heard quotes up to $70,000, even $100,000 a mile, and so that's pretty substantial investment for a producer. But if they are in the situation of having a substantial number of 40 horsepower or more motors, that's maybe something that they need to look at, or maybe just also look at looking at the VFDs but also just talk to the utility company and see what kind of options that they may have to help out with. So that becomes a big challenge, particularly with irrigators that are irrigating during the high peak demand areas of the year, especially in June where we have high air conditioning costs and power needs. So that's one of those situations that they have to take a look at. Of course, natural gas prices have been an interesting situation for producers. As of late, they've, earlier this spring and so on, they've been pretty moderate. And so there's about two different types of producers, those that are on natural gas and those that wish they were on natural gas at times. But, of course, with anything, we're seeing quite a bit of interest in, other technologies utilizing natural gas, even vehicle transportation. So as a result, is that going to maintain? Those are questions we have to ask ourselves. Also, the propane prices, they've been, quite a bit better than they have been in the last couple of years. But once again, there's some volatility issues that go with that. Of course, the year of 2009, grain drying in Indiana, particularly in a lot of places across the Midwest, it was a pretty substantial investment. So getting that propane tank filled was not a cheap endeavor. But when looking at a grain drying upgrade, okay, maybe you want to have the nicest new fancy grain dryer, and here's an example of one that we helped a producer install up in north central Indiana. This is a mixed flow variety of a dryer, and he's very, very happy with it. A lot of questions that we asked him, as well as several of our other clients that we work with, is, of course, how often are you utilizing the field drying as much as possible with it wherever it's logical? Are your dryer burners adjusted for maximum efficiency? And if you're dealing with a dryer that maybe you installed back in the 70s or 80s that doesn't have that hasn't been maintained properly, there's quite a bit of efficiency loss likely in those situations. And we look at those situations. What's your maintenance schedule and so on? Particularly in grain quality, and that's this is the Dirk Meyer legacy here at Purdue University. Where's our grain quality? I mean, we look at energy efficiency drying, and we can certainly crank that plenum temperature up to a high level. But at the same time, while we want to get in and out of the field and get on with our lives after harvest, perhaps maybe taking a few steps back and slowing down and making sure that grain quality is dried and the grain is dried properly and not over drying is not only going to add to your energy efficiency over time by not overheating and over drying, and then maybe drying past that 15 points of moisture, but you're also going to maintain a better quality of grain, and we certainly need that, of course, in years such as these. Do you have a pre-cleaning system in your grain drying outfit? If a grain drying setup, I mean, it's only as good as what the grain that's coming in. Is there a lot of excess chaff? Is there weed seed? A lot of those things you just have to take a look at. And some people have been going to farm shows and they'll see that natural air drying is the newest and latest technology. Well, you have to ask yourself, is this something logical for you with the number of bushels you're drying annually? So we have to ask ourselves, can we logically natural air dry a bin we're looking at 10 points of moisture removal, and likely is no. So is dry aeration something that you would be able to operate with if you do have natural air, and if you do have that situation, you've got some, if you have, there's just a lot of variables there. Leveling the grain in the bin, looking at maximizing your plenum temperature without damaging that grain, and so on do you often, what we ask sometimes are, do you have a high capacity dryer that has some kind of a heat reclaim technology? And sometimes those are able to boost some energy efficiency, 10, maybe even 20%, depending on the type of dryer. Some people have actually modified their dryers to do this, and I give them a lot of credit for that. But at the same time, managing full heat drying is an interesting concept for folks. It's not necessarily the most time efficient for folks because they have to do some transfer and then dry aeration, and sometimes they have condensation issues and so on if not done properly. But those last few points of moisture removal can be the most energy intensive. And so if we can take advantage of the natural steeping of that hot grain and just put some air on it, and do some dry aeration, perhaps you can save some energy, particularly when we have some high fuel costs like we've had in the past. So in addition to this, we all realize, a lot of us probably on the line here realize there's funding opportunities for producers to upgrade their grain drying systems. And so they hear about a grant program like the USDA REAP grant, or maybe some commercial industrial rebate programs for the utility company and so on. So they come to us with asking for the first phase of doing this work, of applying for these types of dollars, and they're asking for an energy audit. And then we go down this path of asking, what kind of drying system are you currently operating with, and where are you going to go? Oftentimes we're really uncovering the fact that the real motivation is they want to increase on-farm storage. And that's very important a lot of times for marketing aspects. And these days, particularly with the marketing avenues available to producers, considering the new ethanol industry that we have, and some of those other motivating factors to hold on to that grain maybe a little longer. Some producers are wanting to expand their capacity, their drying capacity, in terms of the bushels per hour. Maybe they want to double that size. And is that really going to add energy efficiency, although we're going to have a faster rate? So, oftentimes producers are wanting to get that grain dumped, dried, and moved on so they can keep going and harvest. It's a really important aspect for producers. But does that translate to energy efficiency is the question. And oftentimes we have some producers that come to us and want to replace an in-bin drying system with a high capacity, high plenum temperature, high burn rate bushel per hour system, and we just can't make the numbers work in efficiency-wise, energy-wise. So we have to kind of weed out some of those before we go down this path of an energy audit. Some of those checklists that we have to look at is, like we discussed, of course, there's some variability in the grain. Over-drying can be wasteful. Of course, remove broken kernels and weed seeds through cleaning and so on. We just kind of went through that. And also too, there's so much more automation controls on these dryers. You don't have to necessarily babysit them as much as you had to do in the past. So not only that, but you also can perhaps put more sensoring in and look at how you can maybe upgrade a drying system that may actually bring that efficiency just for the sake of just operating with a bit more oversight and controls. So beyond all that and all those questions are asked, then we have we entered into a process of doing an energy audit for producers. And so when we looked at establishing our protocol for putting together these audits, we looked at the tools that Dr. Dirk Meyer and his team had developed over a period of time, and a validation of those tools through dryer tests. They actually get in and collected data from drying systems from across several different types of drying systems and companies, and put that data in to a simulation tool that will operate, here at a desktop. And so that we feel is, a snapshot in time to give an overview of what the potential drying cost would be for a certain scenario with a different type of dryer, with all the inputs and so on. And the thing is that we have some producers that will collect up utility bills and gas bills over the period of about 3 or 4 years. And if you take a look at 2008 up until, say, even this year's harvest, 2008 was a moderate drying year. 2009 was ridiculous in terms of the year of vomit toxins and the need to really just dry a tremendous amount of points of moisture removal across the entire spectrum of that harvest. 2010, we had such a dry year, we had a hard time finding wet enough corn to go out and do dryer tests with. And then we had, last year, which was somewhat sort of the same. And then we've had a bit more of a normal or variable year this year, but we've also had some fall rains. So what I'm trying to address is the fact that if you average all those years, you really wouldn't get a very thorough and logical description of the energy efficiency of a drying system in those various years. especially when you look at the variability in climate and temperature, relative humidity during those years. You're looking at the variability of the actual energy needed at different points of moisture removal. Because like I mentioned before, those points that when you get closer to that 15%, which is where our target is, or just in that vicinity, the points that are approaching that's where we have the most intensive energy use for points of moisture removal. So with that being said, we wanted to take a look at some of those situations. And yes, we could take some calculations there, but a lot of this work we wanted to take off the desktop and take it off the shelf and actually put it into practice for this energy audit program. And so that's been a real beneficial opportunity for us here with use of Dirk Meyer's program and Dr. O'Connell's work. So with that being said, we'll take a look at a drying system that the producer comes to us with. We have them fill out a questionnaire sheet. We have conversation back and forth. We have a description of that system, and we'll also take a look at what are some of the variability, what's some of the issues with the current dryer. We'll put the same exact variables on that particular drying system when we're comparing the new dryer. So we're going to take a look at we're going to use the exact same fuel type and electricity price. Ironically, we will have a few very small percent, maybe 5% of the audits we've done. We've actually had producers transfer from propane over to bringing in natural gas onto the farm. And so those have been an added kick in cost savings. So that's been something we take a look at, but for the most part, we keep those constants the same. We look at the same relative humidity and temperature of the region that we're looking into. We're going to also evaluate that moisture removal from 20 to 15 or 25 to 15. We're going to look at dryer mode. I should have added that on there. I mean, are we looking at full heat, or are we looking at dryers that are looking at some heat reclaim? There's a very good presentation that North Dakota State put out there on e-extension about various different dryer types and so on, and I would encourage folks to want to learn more to get out there and check out that presentation. But we'll also look at the number of bushels dried. Essentially, we'll get those numbers through asking how many corn acres they're putting out and how many bushel per acre they're getting. So we're just trying to make things as constant as possible between these two different dryer evaluations. Here's a very interesting, it's not necessarily a typical example of a producer that we work with, but it's a very interesting example, and I'm going to show you some reasons why the numbers came out very interestingly. But we took a look at this producer's drying system up in northeast Indiana. We looked at the fact that this producer was currently operating with natural gas, and at that time when we did the evaluation, the cost for his natural gas was at $1.25 per therm. The electricity rate was 12 cents, which is a very typical rate for Indiana. Actually, in some parts of northern Indiana, we'll get a little higher rate than that, but for the most part, that's a typical rate here. We looked at a 25 to 15 points of moisture removal, and we also looked at, in this particular evaluation, the relative humidity was 65%. Ambient was at 50 degrees. This producer was drying an annual about 66,000 bushels per year, and that's on about a 400-acre operation. So we're not talking about a very large farming system here in the context of a typical Midwest farm, but he also had some beans in addition to that and hay ground. So he was typically drying about 400 acres, I should say, annually. This operating system that he was currently using was a dryer he installed in 1978 as a batch dryer. He operated as a dry-cool situation. He relayed on to us that the burner rate was just very inconsistent, and that he oftentimes found that he was over-drying the corn. The plenum temperature would be, spike at times, and that 220 degree Fahrenheit, that's pretty severe level of heat when it comes to looking at dryer grain quality. So at times he felt like that he needed to just babysit that dryer. It operated with a 10 horsepower fan, and then of course a lot of times when these dryers get some age, what they're rated for in terms of bushel per hour can actually be inconsistent with what they really actually do. So he had about 174 bushel per hour on this system. The new dryer was going to operate on a continuous flow basis with pressure, heat, suction, cool. So he was getting some benefit of reclaiming some of that hot air back into the dryer, so he doesn't have to start at ambient temperature air at 50, which is the average, evening and daytime temperature during harvest that this particular producer had. So that actual savings was there in that regard to getting some actual heat back into the dryer before having to be exhausted out. And this new dryer operated with about a 295 bushel per hour. There were some other variables that we looked at in addition to, but this is just a mock-up example. Here's some of the kickback information that we brought out into the report that we provided them as for their evaluation of the energy audit. If you talk, and we look at BTUs of energy savings, we convert everything to BTUs on our energy audits in an effort to be consistent with the USDA rural development guidelines. And so this producer was actually consuming more electricity and BTUs of electricity with this new dryer because he had a larger horsepower motor, fan motor. So, there's some of that that enters into this, that sometimes, these dryers that are older that only had like a 10 horsepower on it, sometimes we just need a little more airflow rate and so on. And it gets to a point too where some people will swap out a motor on their older dryer to where they just have one sitting in the shop and one, it's ready to go, and so they'll just put it on the dryer and they just kind of retrofit it. So there's some variability there. So in this case, he actually was using more power, but he was saving a substantial amount of gas in natural gas savings. So his overall BTU savings was just under 400,000. 400 million BTUs, I should say, pardon me. And so when we take that to the numbers in terms of the total amount of therms of fuel, total amount of kilowatt hours used, his drying cost for drying down about 66,000 bushels was just under $5,000 a year at 10 points of moisture removal. And so that put him as cost savings at 33.24%. But we wanted to be more accurate with the energy efficiency evaluation. So we actually took the BTUs saving to calculate the percentage of energy efficiency. And when we looked at the BTU level, we were actually at that 35.56%. And the reason I highlighted this particular project is that that 35% is a very target number that the USDA has a scoring criteria on. So I thought that was a very interesting number, but that's the way the numbers came out. And he just slipped into that range of being a very, scoring a good amount of points for the BTU savings and energy efficiency. Now, when we look at the simple payback calculation, this is where it gets interesting. This producer had $120,000 payback, or $120,000 project cost, which was, terribly inflated. It was a case where he was adding in to his total project cost, and I put this out as an example with this producer that he needed to pare down that project cost because even though he had a very good energy savings, his years to payback was like over 25 years, which most people in the banking industry, let alone USDA rural development or any other grant or loan program, that's a pretty high payback, and that's not going to be a very viable payback. So this person was going to add for everything under the sun, a wet holding bin, new augers for the entire system of, had a grading legs and so on. It was just the point where he needed to pare that down. So in working with his particular grant writer, he actually got to the point where he was able to get that project cost to a reasonable level and then get the payback to where it needed to be. So one of the additional reasons for that high payback was that he just had a project cost that was way more than what he was really set up to do in terms of his work annually. And also, too, at that time, natural gas related to propane was working against them. So I took a valuation of the price on a per BTU basis of natural gas versus propane. And in this particular scenario where we have $2.10 per gallon propane and $1.25 per therm natural gas, which those are numbers that were relevant to some of those times back then, he was looking at the fact that he was on natural gas was so much of a benefit to him. He was actually saving about 54% of the cost of doing the same amount of grain drying as he would if he was on propane. So all these variables, every grain drying project that comes to us for an evaluation, they're all very much different. And we have to really help walk these producers through to make sure that they're making the right decisions and moving forward properly to be successful. So with all this being said, we've done a lot of work with these grain dryer projects across Indiana, and as well as other states. We have producers that come to us through various channels, and we're able to work with them as far as, feeling that we, collaborate with the other land-grant universities in those states and others, and we feel like we're making some impact. But at the same time, we feel like we're not doing ourselves a service to make sure that we're moving forward and making sure our tools are viable. And so we've been embarking on doing some data collection from producers. We are waiting on this year's harvest to complete before we actually start working on some of the data. But there's been some interesting numbers that have come through. But we've worked with a lot of clients from 2008 until now. And we want to use this to validate our tools. About 84% of the respondents claim that they were actually happy with their grain dryer improvements. So that's a good number, but at the same time, what's the 16%? And I'd like to find that out further as we move forward. One thing, too, that was, as far as a tool, we did roll out an online tool that was to be able to be used for producers or anybody for that matter to essentially do the same type of simulation work. This was a project that was funded with the NRCS CIG grant program that Dr. Aliligy was able to establish. And we had a few graduate students work on it to get it up and going. It was a pretty tedious task, even just to get it online. One of the variables that we had found through some discussions with others and when we went to look at validation was there were some hiccups in the wheat drying side. And so with that being said, we had to pull it offline. Meanwhile, Dr. Aliligy is on sabbatical. We've also had some graduate student changes. So we'll hopefully get that available sooner than later. I know there's several people that have been interested in using that program, and we really do want to get it out there as soon as we can. It's just a case where when we do put it back out online, we want to be sure that it's useful. So essentially, if anybody is interested in doing just a random simulation of a typical dryer, just contact me and I can use our desktop tools that are available to us here and provide you some data, and we'd be glad to accommodate in any way possible there. So I'm kind of moving forward here with a few more examples beyond just grain drying because we have so many opportunities there that we're trying to tap into, and I feel like we're making some progress beyond grain drying work here at Purdue. But it's interesting, when I had a presentation in southern Indiana with a group of dairy farmers, we had a cover crops gentleman that came and spoke to the farmers about, what is the potential for grazing during early spring and maybe fall months of the year on some cover crops. And, one of the comments that he had before I came on the docket was to talk about greening your parlor. And it was a case where I had a different spin on greening your parlor as opposed to, pasture grazing dairy cows on some, very lush green grass. So we had some fun with the play on words there. But I want to give some credit to Algo and his folks up at Michigan State. I had the chance to team up with a group of auditors up there at Michigan State, and we did an audit for a producer. And, of course, there's various different options for dairy farmers because they're utilizing their systems 7 days a week all year round. So, grain dryer is going to sit dormant for about 10 months out of the year, hopefully no more than that, maybe ideally less, while they consume more energy. A dairy farm operation has a more consistent level of need. So with that being said, we have had some success at looking at water heating, but primarily we're looking at milk cooling, ventilation, and lighting. Those are our main key areas for a typical dairy farm to look at. We're going to take a look at a few examples with regard to manure handling, but at the end, in the end of the day, that's just, for a typical dairy operation, it's, that dairy is maybe pumping out that lagoon maybe a few days every 6 months, and so while they may be it's not quite the substantial amount of energy use as in, say, the milk cooling, ventilation, and lighting. We looked at a dairy operation that was doing some things well, and that was exciting for us to see. They had made some renovations of their dairy operation in somewhat recent times, and so they already had a plate cooler in, and a plate cooler, for those who are not well versed in the dairy sector, is essentially bringing up well water, temperature water, and running the milk past that piping with that cool water. So you're having a pre-cooling situation of that milk before it goes into the bulk tank where it's cooled down further. Those plate coolers, then bring up that well water, and that's water that would have had to have been pumped anyway, and it goes into the watering system for the cows. So it's really a situation where it makes good sense. This producer, we calculated, was saving on the upwards of 44,000 kilowatt hours and about a $5,300 a year savings. Also on the milk pump, which operates quite consistently, he had installed a variable frequency drive in addition to their vacuum pump to get the milk transported around. And so they had some savings. They had a hot water preheater, which was substantial. And then dairy operations have to wash, they have a washing machine for towels and worker garments and so on. And so as a result of putting in the Energy Star washing machine, they had done a nice job of saving some reasonable amount of energy there. So here's an example of what this producer, we calculated out what their potential energy savings would be in relation to other, what they are already doing is by making the current upgrades that they had, and you can see the plate cooler upgrades, that was a pretty substantial or pretty much a no-brainer payback period for this producer, as well as the upgrading the milk pump of the V8 VFD and also the vacuum pump. So those were some pretty good numbers payback-wise, and that capital investment of $8,000 was a pretty wise investment for them to move forward with. We took a look at the lighting situation, and they were using quite a bit of incandescent bulbs for the cows in certain places within the parlor. They also had some T12 bulbs and had a few of the T8 bulbs in their office. And then they also had several metal halide lights located throughout the cow units, the barn, the holding places, and so on. And so their annual consumption was calculated out to just about 51,000 kilowatt hours at a cost for lighting annually about $6,600. One of the gentlemen that were on our team has been very much tracking the LED lighting industry, and with a lot of other work that he does. And so he came up with this concept of replacing several of these metal halides and some of these incandescents with some LED tubes. And what it amounts to is these systems, essentially instead of replacing, say, a T12 ballast with a T8 that will eventually have to be replaced in the short period of time anyway when LED lights really truly turn the corner. It's a case where why don't we get to the point where we have the capacity to put these LED lighting tubes in now, and then when the bulbs evolve in the next couple of years as they exponentially are moving forward with, then we'll be ready to go and we'll have to replace those ballasts again. It's a case where the lighting quality can be a challenge, and also the long life of some of these LEDs are in debate, And this isn't necessarily an endorsement for LED tubes in relation to others, but I thought it was an interesting evaluation and maybe some foresight. And this was a decision that the producer had to make management-wise to see if they really wanted to go forward and do this. But based off of the recommendations and our calculations, if they were to use the LED lights, granted, they may not have the same quality or the same level of, same exact type of system. They were looking at about a 10,000 kilowatt hour per year savings, and that generated back down to about a 3.9 year payback, which is in certain range for being reasonable. So that was an interesting discussion that we had among ourselves there at Michigan State and others. But essentially, we'll just kind of move on, but there's some other calculations. This particular producer had a single-phase manure pump installed, mostly because he wanted to free up his tractor PTO that was currently operating with it. And so that was, while the payback period was a little higher in terms of 11 years, this is something that a producer wanted to do to just, not only save some energy, but mostly from a management perspective, free up that tractor for other use on the farm. There was also an interesting situation, and I really, applaud Michigan State's energy auditing program for looking at the entire perspective of agricultural production. In some ways, we can save energy, but it may be a detriment to our production on the back end. And so there's some concepts of long day lighting and increasing energy, increasing energy use, but also increasing milk production and revenue consequently. And so this particular 150 cow operation installed these 12 high pressure sodium lights, which were an added benefit, but also allowed for some added long day lighting. Those cows were also, not only you had the hardware cost of $2,700 to do this, they had an increase of $540 of electricity use. They also had the increase of feed costs because the cows were eating more. And so the total cost all around was about $8,700. But their increased revenue from milk production was just over $23,000. And so when you look at the payback period, that was actually bringing in more revenue for that producer if they were able to install long day lighting that was relatively energy efficient. So that was one of those concepts which I feel is kind of helps a producer take notice and say, hey, this particular energy auditor is not necessarily trying to convince me to save and cut off all kinds of energy use, but actually taking a look at the energy as a benefit to their operation from a production standpoint as well. Here in the last several months, we've also had a chance to collaborate with Michigan State, and I see my time is getting short, so I'm going to move forward relatively quickly. But we got into some greenhouse operations to do energy audits, and we did an audit for a producer that produced bedding plants for wholesale production to some of the big box stores up in Michigan, South Central Michigan. This particular operation facility sat under about 2.5 acres of glass, and I shouldn't say glass, it was other materials, but mostly a family-owned operation. They operated with natural gas, single-phase power, and so on. Here's just an overview, aerial view of their operation, and so they had quite a bit of capacity here. We looked at a lot of different systems within not only their offices, but also for their heating units, of course. We looked at weatherization opportunities to shore up some leaks and so on. Just a little bit about hot water heating. The only hot water that they truly used was just a 40-gallon tank for the employee hand washing in the restrooms. We also looked at energy curtains, which actually help conserve that energy during the evening hours of a greenhouse. We looked at lighting. There's some really interesting outcomes from lighting, and then, of course, some ventilation. They were currently operating with some of these gravity-vented systems, which is illustrated here. and that operated at about a 65% efficiency, and then a power vented system was at about a 78%. And so we wanted to compare replacing those and swapping out these outdated heaters with something that was more energy efficient, and we looked at something that was about a 93 efficiency level. We also looked at air infiltration. They had some leaks and some gaps within the louvers of the ventilation systems with no covers on those ventilation systems during the winter months. They had some interesting, some exhaust pipes that were just, there were some challenges there. And then you also had some gaps with some of the fittings that went through the roof. So this is kind of a typical scenario. Most people that are in greenhouse production, they about need somebody to come in on a third-party basis to kind of bring their attention that there's some things that need to be done. A lot of times these people are under some pretty pressure-filled constraints to get their production out the door and done, and energy sometimes isn't always the first thing on their mind. So we feel like that there's been some good work that Michigan State has done up there, and we're hoping to replicate some of that down here in Indiana. But essentially, here's some examples of these energy curtains, and so they've can save up to about 30% energy. We were looking at these curtains, and what our calculations came out to be about 32% energy savings. The capital cost with those energy curtains that we were looking at was about $228,000, so we're at a bit of a higher payback period. So that was one of the issues that we're taking a look at, and the producer was presented this audit, and I'd be interested to see what their outlook was on doing energy curtains. The weatherization of the greenhouse was just another no-brainer. That was even less than a year payback period. There's about a 4.5-year payback with the higher efficient heater units, increasing insulation within the barn, which is kind of their prep area where they do a lot of their seeding work and so on. 1.2-year payback. And then also within the barn, which is outside of the greenhouse units, looking at improving that. Here's another situation where they don't use grow lights on this particular operation, but they use lighting for employees within the office space, the break rooms, the restrooms, and then in their barn unit, they have these T12 ballasts. And so once again, we took a look at energy efficient LED tube lights. And my apologies for the massive amount of numbers here, but in the end of the day, the payback period is a pretty substantial area to look into. One of the things that we wanted to demonstrate is the fact that, okay, if we take a look at a storage room, which is maybe accessed and needs lighting maybe 1 hour per week as compared to, say, some of these other rooms, office areas and so on, where there's more consistent need. We didn't necessarily feel like those were needing LED tubes, so we recommended CFLs for some of those. That's a pretty costly Cadillac system to put into something where you're only flipping the switch every once in a while. So that's kind of a concept of just general energy efficiency-wise, where we made some recommendations. But once again, with the anticipation of LED lighting to continue to advance, some of these payback periods were a little high, but some were within reason. And within the barn, they were about a 3.9-year payback, and so that may be a viable option for them to pursue and consider. We also looked at the fact that this was one of those interesting aha moments, I guess, that I had. Algo went through and we looked and counted 46 of these ballasts within the greenhouse systems, and when we counted all those, we came to realize that those were magnetic ballasts. And so those were actually consuming energy while they're not even being turned on. And actually the manager of that greenhouse said he didn't even remember the last time that they turned on the lights within the greenhouse, actually. So those were sitting there drawing power. There was a ballast efficiency factor loss presumed at about 1.13, maybe a little lower than that perhaps. But when we did the calculations, we were looking at they were pulling about 29 watts per day. So this was what we call a phantom load. And so each ballast is drawing about 29 watts per day. We looked at the fact that there was, 46 of these altogether. We looked at the total kilowatt hours of consumption at 12 cents per kilowatt hour. So without even turning these systems on, they were drawing about $1,400 of power. And I thought that was just, decommissioning those, taking them out of there altogether was just the simple fact of going to pay back immediately. So that was, I thought, fairly substantial finding for them. Also, there was some ventilation fan belt efficiency issues. Al and some of the team had infrared lights, infrared heat detection units, and so like there was showing up quite a bit of heat loss around the belt, and the fact that that was showing some undue friction, and so that was if there was just some general maintenance, not necessarily having to replace the motor or anything, but just some general maintenance, that adjustment could save about 15% energy savings. That wasn't a necessary energy conservation measure in terms of replacing a unit, but just doing some maintenance. Real quick, we've worked with about 5 irrigators in Indiana. We have several pockets in the state. It's not prolific in Indiana, but we have some pockets in the northern part of the state, and then we also have some aquifers in the southern part. And we also have some melon producers down in Vincennes area. We've had several producers that had been working with some diesel engines, 60, 70 horsepower diesel engines sitting out in a field with a high pressure traveling spray gun. Those are pretty easy to get initiated an irrigation operation with, but they're just terribly, in terms of capital costs, but they're just, energy inefficient. And so what some of these producers were able to do was to swap out those diesel engines, go to an electric motor, and then go from a high pressure system to a low pressure system, thus saving on the total amount of energy needed to actually operate those systems. While those are a substantial energy cost, their savings of energy was about 65% in some of these cases. And that's somewhat consistent, I feel like, with the data that came from Nebraska on some of the irrigation. So we've had some successful producers being able to take advantage of the REAP program for that. I had a very interesting project that came in last year as well that we collaborated with our local extension educator up in Noble County, up in northwest Indiana. They had a small maple syrup operation. It's kind of a hobby operation for this producer. They're converting about 4,000 gallons of sap to 100 gallons of syrup, which, this is something that this is a retiree, that this is something he likes to do. But he also was paying a substantial amount for just getting that fuel oil, and the cost of that was just over $2,000 annually to get that 100 gallons of syrup. So essentially, he was going to install a reverse osmosis unit, which would actually bring the sugar content up and reduce the water content up to 70% of that sap, and then it goes to a burner evaporator. He was going old school, and he actually was going to go back to a wood burning evaporator. He had a grandson that was willing to, that had a willing and able back, and he was going to collect some wood off the operation. And so we calculated as if, I don't know if he was paying his grandson, but we calculated as if the fuel source was at a no cost. But essentially, it was about a $7.39 cost of getting that syrup at that level. So those were some really interesting numbers. We just kind of worked closely with the extension educator up there to work with putting this project together. And I don't know for sure if this project was supported, but I think they did apply for USDA funds. So anyway, moving ahead, his payback period is, in the end of the day, in terms of annual energy savings and cost savings and so on, his payback period was about 8.5 years. Once again, if you're not familiar with the USDA REAP grant program, it's currently tied to the Farm Bill. We are not necessarily promoting the fact that a producer can apply or get an energy audit, but there are some people that are moving forward as if the REAP grant will survive the Farm Bill. It's just like any other risk. So, but for the most part, we are awaiting the situation at hand with our election and so on to see if the REAP program will survive. We are getting an indication, which I shouldn't even go down too far of a path, but we're getting an indication from DC that there's some favorability to REAP. Now, that could all change. We have no idea for sure. Same with the NRCS EQUIP program. Our local office here in Indiana, Tony Bailey and his team, are looking at getting the EQUIP program involved with energy efficiency improvement. Once again, that's something that's in current process for verification. So if you're out there and maybe it comes after January, get in touch with your EQUIP program to see if it's out there available for you. The DSIRE website is always very good for anybody in various states to look at what are some of the incentives out there. And then also in Indiana, as well as in what I found in Michigan, we have some utility programs that are coming available for several producers on the commercial and industrial side to benefit some payouts and some cost sharing for retrofits. So many farms are being able to benefit from that, because if a producer's on a residential rate program, they're likely not going to be able to benefit from this. But some of our larger farmers are on a C&I program, commercial and industrial. And so companies like Clear Result, our third-party administrator for some of the utility programs, they actually have some of those dollars available to apply for. And those are about 2 or 3 page documents to apply for as in relation to REAP, USDA REAP, which I should say REAP's a beneficial program, but it is a red tape-ridden program. These are pretty simple, and a lot of these companies have the dollars and are really wanting to help out the ag sector. So with that being said, just some examples. We got a little more detail available on our website. Feel free to come and take a look. Want to also just give credit to Dr. Klein Alilji as our Associate Professor and Extension Engineer on this program, and thank him for all of his work on helping us get this program established. I feel like we do about half of our work in this our extension program is tied to on-farm energy efficiency, and that's a result of just looking at responsible energy use in addition to renewables.
This webinar has been brought to you by the Farm Energy Community of Practice and the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension. For more information, go to farmenergymedia.extension.org.